The frantic phone call shattered the quiet dawn of July 4th, 1954, in the wealthy, tight-knit suburb of Bay Village, Ohio. At 5:40 in the morning, on the other end of the line, Dr. Sam Sheppard was gasping for air, telling his close friend, the local mayor, that his 31-year-old pregnant wife, Marilyn, had been brutally murdered. When Cuyahoga County authorities arrived at the sprawling lakefront home at 28924 West Lake Road, they stepped into a waking nightmare. The once peaceful second-floor bedroom was painted in blood, presenting a deeply unsettling scene of savage violence where Marilyn had suffered 35 crushing blows to the head, an act of brutality that would soon captivate and horrify the entire nation. Sam offered a terrifying explanation for the massacre, detailing a violent, desperate struggle in the dark. He claimed he had been sleeping on a downstairs corduroy daybed, recovering from a long shift at the hospital, when he was suddenly awakened around 3 o'clock in the morning by his wife crying out his name in sheer panic from the floor above. Rushing up the stairs, Sam said he saw a dark figure, the silhouette of a bushy-haired intruder, standing over his wife's bed before he was struck from behind and knocked completely unconscious. He told police he woke up moments later, chased the fleeing shadow out of the house and down a 50-foot cliff to the shores of Lake Erie, where they fought again until the doctor was choked out in the shallow water. But as daylight broke over the lake, the house revealed a series of chilling unknowns that left local investigators completely baffled. The brutal killer had vanished into the morning mist, yet strangely, not a single valuable item, no expensive jewelry left in plain sight, and no stack of money from the doctor's wallet had been stolen from the wealthy home. Even more disturbing was the profound mystery of the quiet house itself. The exterior screen doors were entirely unlocked, showing no signs of forced entry. There were no clear, sandy footprints left by the fleeing stranger on the stairs, and Coco, the family's young Weimaraner dog known to bark at the slightest noise, had not made a single sound during the entire brutal ordeal. Imagine the sheer terror of waking from a violent blackout, soaked in cold lake water, with fractured neck vertebrae, only to find your entire world violently destroyed and the person you love most gone forever. Now imagine the creeping horror as the medical shock wears off, and you realize the police are no longer searching the shadows for a monster because they are looking directly at you. This case taps into the absolute deepest fears of the human heart. It is the terrifying realization that your suburban sanctuary can be violated in the middle of the night, and that the very people sworn to protect you might suddenly shift their focus, utilizing the crushing weight of the state to cast you as the villain of your own unimaginable tragedy. To understand the massive shockwave this sent through the community, one must look at the picture-perfect life the couple lived before the crime. Dr. Sam Sheppard and his wife Marilyn were the absolute golden couple of their upper-middle-class town, high school sweethearts from Cleveland Heights who were young, incredibly rich, and highly respected by everyone who knew them. Sam was a handsome, athletic, and highly successful 30-year-old osteopathic neurosurgeon working at his family's prominent hospital, while Marilyn was known for her beauty, grace, and fierce dedication to their 7-year-old son, who was sleeping just down the hall. They hosted lavish neighborhood parties, drove expensive Jaguar sports cars, and seemed to possess a life completely untouched by darkness or struggle. Yet, behind the heavy wooden doors of their 14-room lakeside mansion, that flawless mid-century American dream was already beginning to fracture. The pristine facade of domestic bliss was actively hiding deep cracks, mounting professional pressures from the medical practice, and unspoken marital tensions that echoed silently through the expansive property long before the murder took place. Investigators slowly began to uncover the unsettling truths hidden behind the couple's perfect public smiles. Whispers and rumors circulated through the hospital corridors, pointing to Sam having a secret, ongoing romance in California with a 24-year-old former medical technician named Susan Hayes, a scandalous affair that involved secret rendezvous and expensive gifted watches. This hidden betrayal painted a new, tragic picture of Marilyn, a woman who may have been trapped in deep sadness, desperately trying to hold her family together while her husband looked the other way. The motive for murder, police theorized, might not belong to a random intruder, but to a husband desperate to escape his domestic life without facing the ruinous financial scandal of a high society divorce in the conservative 1950s. Finding the truth, however, was immediately compromised by the catastrophic failures of the very first police officers to arrive at the house. Instead of establishing a strict perimeter to protect fragile clues, the inexperienced local authorities allowed the crime scene to descend into absolute chaos, treating the bloody home more like a public spectacle than a secure forensic environment. Friends, family members, and a swarm of eager newspaper reporters were permitted to freely wander through the house, walking over bloodstains and touching critical surfaces. Crucial evidence was permanently trampled. Relatives packed away personal items, and neighbors even cleaned up the kitchen before forensic experts could even begin to properly photograph the rooms or secure the murder weapon. Every muddy footprint left by a curious neighbor permanently erased the silent whispers of the actual killer. Dozens of unauthorized civilian shoes tracked dirt across the carpets, completely obliterating any microscopic fibers, blood spatter patterns, or delicate trace evidence that the genuine perpetrator might have left behind in their frantic escape from the second-floor bedroom. The exact moment the investigation shifted remains a chilling turning point in American legal history. Standing in the ruined house, looking at a doctor with a fractured neck and a wild story about a bushy-haired phantom, the lead Cleveland detective made a fateful, unalterable decision, dismissing the terrifying lakefront struggle as a desperate, calculated fabrication. He pointed a finger directly at the bleeding, broken husband, openly calling his story a blatant lie. In that instant, the local hunt for a mysterious white-shirted intruder ended entirely, and the relentless, crushing machinery of the justice system turned all of its massive weight onto Sam Sheppard, initiating a media-driven prosecution that would define the decade. The detectives sifting through the shattered home quickly stopped looking for an outside intruder and turned their cold gaze upon the grieving husband. Their suspicion was fueled by a glaring absence in the evidence, a missing piece that defied logic. Sam Sheppard claimed he had fought a brutal intruder on the beach, yet the t-shirt he had been wearing that night was entirely gone. Investigators became convinced he had stripped off the blood-soaked shirt and thrown it deep into the dark waters of Lake Erie to hide his guilt. This theory of a staged crime scene grew stronger when officers examined the doors and windows of the lakefront house. They found absolutely no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass near the locks, and no broken door frames to suggest a desperate break-in. To the police, the untouched locks told a very clear story, whispering that the true killer was someone who already had a key and belonged inside the home. The sheer hatred evident in the bedroom painted a terrifying picture that the police could not ignore. Marilyn had not just been killed, she had been obliterated by an attacker who struck her over 30 times with a heavy, blunt object. This was a crime of intense personal rage, a furious explosion of violence that left the room coated in a horrific spray of red. Investigators looked at this extreme, hateful violence and then looked back at Sam, struggling to connect the two scenes. They could not understand how a phantom intruder could unleash such a frenzy of deadly rage upon Marilyn, yet only managed to bump Sam on the head and leave him alive. The stark contrast between her total destruction and his survival became a dark shadow hanging over his every word. The blood-stained walls of that upstairs bedroom stood as a silent, grim testament to a fury that no simple robbery could explain. Outside the shattered quiet of the Sheppard home, a different kind of storm began to gather as local newspapers decided to play both judge and jury. Reporters swarmed the small town, trading objective facts for angry, sensational stories designed to sell copies and stir public outrage. They painted a picture of a wealthy, privileged doctor who was somehow above the law, manipulating the system to avoid the consequences of a brutal murder. Daily columns demanded to know why this rich man was allowed to sleep comfortably in his own bed instead of rotting in a cold jail cell where he belonged. This relentless media influence began to poison the minds of the community, turning neighbors into suspicious enemies and replacing silent grief with a loud, unified demand for immediate vengeance. There is a chilling power in a crowd that has been fed the same daily diet of anger and accusation. When everyone on the street reads the exact same furious headlines over their morning coffee, the complex, actual truth of a tragedy begins to vanish into thin air. The real human beings involved are erased, replaced by simple, hateful caricatures drawn in black printer ink. It remains deeply unsettling to wonder how much the police investigation was actually driven by evidence, and how much was forced by the roar of the angry mob outside their windows. The detectives were no longer just solving a murder, they were answering to a furious public that had already decided the husband was a monster who needed to be locked away. The quiet streets of the suburb were buried under a blizzard of newsprint, every single page screaming for a rapid and brutal justice. The breaking point arrived in the form of a specific, shocking front-page newspaper editorial titled, "Why Isn't Sam Sheppard in Jail?" This single piece of paper acted like a lit match dropped into a barrel of gasoline, completely obliterating any remaining patience the police might have had. It was a direct public threat to the authorities, demanding an arrest to satisfy the bloodlust of the readers. Step by step, the media dictated the timeline of the law, forcing the police to march to the Sheppard family home the very next day. They did not arrive with new evidence, but with handcuffs, dragging a stunned Sam away from his family and throwing him into a cell to appease the screaming headlines. The quest for truth rapidly devolved into a bizarre spectacle when a mandatory coroner's hearing was organized to question the prime suspect. In a shocking departure from legal norms, this crucial interrogation was not held in a quiet, respectful courtroom, but was instead staged inside a massive high school gymnasium. The bleachers were packed to the rafters with thousands of cheering and booing onlookers, transforming a grave legal process into a cruel public carnival. In the center of this terrifying arena, Sam was forced to sit at a table and answer intimate, probing questions about his life and his murdered wife. His own defense lawyer was present but was strictly forbidden from speaking, leaving the grieving man completely defenseless against the hostile interrogators and the roaring crowd. The echoing cheers and jeers bouncing off the gymnasium walls sounded more like a gladiatorial arena than a search for the truth. By the time the official 1954 murder trial finally began, the atmosphere was so toxic that a fair proceeding seemed entirely impossible. The courtroom was packed so incredibly tight with reporters and photographers from across the country that there was barely room for anyone to breathe. The massive press table stretched all the way to the judge's bench, turning the solemn hall of justice into a chaotic, flashbulb-filled theater. Most devastating of all, the jury was not sequestered or protected from the wild, sensational news stories flooding the city. Every single night, the men and women deciding Sam's fate went home, turned on their radios, and read the evening papers, swallowing an endless stream of unproven lies and hateful rumors about the man sitting before them. The corruption of the trial reached all the way to the very top, revealing a shocking betrayal of trust by the man meant to ensure fairness. Before the trial had even truly started, the presiding judge secretly pulled a prominent reporter aside and whispered that Sam Sheppard was guilty as hell. Before the very first witness took the stand in October 1954, a shocking betrayal of judicial trust had already doomed the defense. Judge Edward Blythen, the man in the black robe who was supposed to guarantee a fair fight, pulled the famous syndicated columnist Dorothy Kilgallen into his chambers and whispered a dark secret. He confided that Dr. Sam Sheppard was guilty as hell, locking his judicial mind against the accused before a single piece of forensic evidence was ever shown in his courtroom. That hidden prejudice poisoned the entire 9-week trial, ensuring the scales of justice were broken from the very start. Because Judge Blythen was facing an upcoming election, he refused multiple defense motions to move the proceedings out of Cuyahoga County, actively allowing the blinding flashbulbs and relentless media circus to physically overrun the courtroom and completely dictate the daily narrative. In the courtroom, Lead prosecutor John Mon faced a massive problem because the state possessed no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no bloody clothes, and absolutely no confession. To win a conviction, the prosecution team had to stop talking about the severely lacking physical evidence and start relentlessly attacking Sam the man. They painted a vivid picture for the jury of a cold, calculating monster who desperately wanted to be permanently free of his pregnant wife without facing a costly divorce. To make this fabricated story stick, the state dragged Sam Sheppard's secret romance with a former hospital technician named Susan Hayes out into the harsh courtroom light. They used his admitted affair to fuel the jury's anger, effectively twisting a moral failing into a concrete motive for brutal murder. The prosecutors did not need to definitively prove how he killed Marilyn Sheppard because they had successfully convinced the room that he was exactly the kind of arrogant man who would. The prosecution strategy worked flawlessly, leading to a heavy, chilling moment on December 21st, 1954, when the exhausted jury returned from deliberations and spoke the word guilty. The prominent surgeon was immediately stripped of his privileged life, his medical license, and his family name, quickly replaced by inmate number 98,715 in a cold, dark cell at the Ohio Penitentiary. He had barely begun to process the trauma of the home invasion and grieve the brutal slaughter of his wife before he was locked away for the rest of his natural life. The profound tragedy of losing the woman he loved was now entirely buried under the crushing weight of losing his own freedom to a broken judicial system that prioritized a fast conviction over factual accuracy. The heavy iron doors of the maximum security facility slammed shut, effectively trapping a grieving widower inside a brutal concrete box. Stripped of his surgical scrubs and forced into heavy prison uniforms, the former chief of neurosurgery was now entirely at the mercy of the violent environment he had been thrown into. Imagine the pure, suffocating terror of being locked in a steel cage for a violent nightmare you did not create. You spend every single waking moment screaming the absolute truth about a bushy-haired intruder, but the entire outside world looks at you and only sees a violent, manipulative liar who battered his pregnant wife to death. This landmark case exposes a terrifying reality about the American justice system, showing exactly how easily the objective truth can be erased when the voting public demands a recognizable villain. It proves that an angry local crowd and a hungry national media can actively build a prison out of sensational rumors, locking away an innocent person without a single drop of hard scientific proof. The devastating ripple effect of this wrongful conviction did not stop at the towering prison walls. While Sam sat helpless in his cell in January 1955, the intense public shame and constant local harassment destroyed his remaining family. Unable to bear the crushing disgrace of her youngest son being branded a monster, Ethel Sheppard tragically took her own life with a revolver, becoming a quiet secondary victim of the relentless media circus. The family tragedy compounded just weeks later, in February 1955, when his father, Dr. Richard Sheppard, completely broken by unimaginable grief and the severe financial stress of the trial, died suddenly of a bleeding stomach ulcer. The false murder accusation had not just stolen Sam Sheppard's promising medical future, it had systematically wiped out the foundational pillars of the people who loved him most. Left almost entirely alone in the world, Sam watched his family legacy vanish from the desolate isolation of a maximum security cell. His only surviving tether to the outside world was his young son, Chip, who was now forced to grow up in the care of relatives while his father served a life sentence for a crime he did not commit. But even in the darkest, most dangerous shadows of the Ohio Penitentiary, Sam Sheppard absolutely refused to surrender his ongoing fight for the truth. Despite facing repeated rejections from the Ohio Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court, he spent his days writing hundreds of desperate letters to new lawyers, federal judges, and anyone who might listen to a forgotten man begging for basic constitutional help. There is a chilling, profound psychological isolation in knowing the absolute truth of your own innocence, while the outside world slowly forgets you even exist behind the barbed wire. It leaves a haunting question hanging in the cold prison air, asking exactly how long a human spirit can survive the brutal conditions of incarceration when all viable legal hope has been systematically stripped away. Nearly a decade of agonizing silence passed before a massive turning point finally arrived in 1961 in the form of a young, fiercely determined defense lawyer named F. Lee Bailey. The ambitious attorney officially took over the seemingly dead case, refusing to accept the heavily biased official story and the corrupted trial transcripts that had sent a respected doctor to rot in a concrete cell. When Bailey finally dug into the dusty cardboard boxes of old case files, he did not find a masterpiece of forensic police work, but rather a massive, horrifying mess of procedural lies and glaring omissions. He saw exactly how the original Cleveland investigators had deliberately ignored crucial clues of a forced entry, twisted basic medical facts, and allowed the real killer to slip away into the night. Guided by fresh eyes and the groundbreaking forensic analysis of criminologist Dr. Paul Kirk, the deeply buried secrets of the 1954 crime scene finally began to see the light of day. Kirk's comprehensive review of the physical evidence provided Bailey with the exact scientific ammunition he needed to challenge the state's entirely circumstantial narrative. The most massive, chilling discovery was hidden in plain sight, waiting in the old black-and-white crime scene photos of the murder room. Bailey and Kirk found clear evidence of a large blood spot on the closet door that was later identified as blood type O, which did not belong to Sam and did not belong to Marilyn. This single, undeniable stain created a profound and terrifying realization that a bleeding third person was absolutely standing in that bedroom. Deep within the dusty case files, the new defense lawyer uncovered a chilling detail that the original investigation had completely buried. There was blood splattered on the closet door in the bedroom where Marilyn died, and scientific tests proved it did not belong to Sam. It also did not belong to Marilyn. This single haunting drop of evidence created a profound and terrifying realization that someone else, a third person, was absolutely in that room on the night of the murder. Armed with this undeniable proof of a flawed investigation, the legal battle pushed relentlessly upward, finally reaching the steps of the United States Supreme Court. The defense stood before the highest judges in the land to expose the dark reality of what happened in 1954. They argued that the angry, screaming newspapers and the secret bias of the trial judge had poisoned the entire process from the start. The young lawyer painted a grim picture of a courtroom that had acted more like a hungry mob than a place of law. He explained in simple, brutal terms that it was impossible for any man to be treated fairly when the jury was reading daily headlines demanding his execution. The justices listened in silence as the illusion of a perfect justice system was carefully dismantled right in front of them. That desperate plea to the highest court in the nation would ultimately force the country to look in the mirror and question the integrity of its own legal foundations. The powerful moment arrived when the Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision that sent shockwaves through the American legal world. The justices ruled that the original trial was nothing more than a carnival, a chaotic spectacle that completely stripped the defendant of his basic human rights. It was a massive, historic victory for justice, but the celebration was suffocated by a heavy, profound sadness. The ruling acknowledged the terrible wrong that had been done, yet it could not give back the 12 agonizing years stolen from a man locked in a cage. The tears shed that day were not just of deep relief, but of mourning for a life that had been permanently derailed by a blind and angry system. With the old conviction erased, a second trial began in 1966, thrusting the broken doctor back into the unforgiving spotlight. This time, however, the courtroom dynamic was entirely different as the defense took absolute control, tearing apart the old police officers when they took the witness stand. The lawyer forced the detectives to admit their sloppy work, exposing how they had ignored obvious clues to build a trap for the husband. The defense pointed directly to the mystery blood on the closet door, demanding to know why the authorities had never bothered to find out whose veins it came from. The new jury was shown exactly how the original investigation was built on desperate guesses and media pressure rather than solid, undeniable facts. As the second trial in the Cuyahoga County Courthouse drew to a close in November 1966, the complete destruction of the state's timeline left the prosecution with nothing but empty theories and exposed lies. The most chillingly impactful moment of the entire ordeal arrived when the jury finally returned to the silent room and spoke the words, "Not guilty." After more than a decade of being branded a monster, Sam Sheppard was legally declared a free man. The heavy iron doors swung open, allowing him to step out into the sunlight without chains for the first time in over 4,000 days. But beneath the surface of this legal triumph lay a deep, unsettling twist that no court could fix. The man was physically free, but his mind and spirit were totally broken by the years of trauma, terror, and isolation. The grim realization settled over his family that you can open the cage and let the prisoner out, but you cannot put a destroyed human being back together again. The tragic reality of his life after prison quickly became a slow, agonizing descent. He tried desperately to go back to being a surgeon, hoping the operating room would bring back the man he used to be, but the damage was too severe. His hands shook violently during procedures, and the relentless whispers of patients and nurses followed him down every hospital hallway. Stripped of his profession and his dignity, he turned to heavy alcohol to numb the constant ringing echoes of his past. The brilliant doctor who once had a picture-perfect life was now wandering through his days as a hollow shell, desperately trying to drink away the memories of a nightmare that refused to end. This devastating return to the outside world proved that the true punishment of a wrongful conviction continues to rot a life long after the cell door is unlocked. The final, sad chapter of this story closed far too soon, ending in a quiet, lonely tragedy. He died at just 46 years old, his body completely ruined by the alcohol he used to survive his own mind. He passed away as a man whose heart had been fundamentally broken by the very society he once swore to heal. The official medical records listed the cause of his death as liver failure, a clinical term that hid the brutal truth. The real cause of his death was the crushing, heavy weight of a wrongful conviction that had slowly suffocated him for 16 years. His passing leaves behind the most terrifying, unanswered question that still haunts the empty rooms of that lakefront house. If the husband did not brutally beat his wife to death on that bloody July morning, who was the dark shadow standing in the bedroom? Somewhere in the night, a violent stranger with blood on their hands simply walked away from the shattered home and vanished into the world. We are left to ponder the chilling reality of a justice system blinded by its own rage. While the police were busy chasing a grieving doctor and the newspapers were busy selling a sensational lie, the real killer was given the greatest gift of all, the freedom to disappear, leaving behind a ruined family and a ghost story that will never truly rest. The shadow that escaped into the night remained unidentified, leaving a void in the police records that no amount of late detective work could ever fill. The failure to secure the house on that July morning meant the real killer's footprints were trampled into dust before investigators even knew to look for them. The destruction of Sam Sheppard's life forced a permanent shift in how American courts handle the overwhelming pressure of public opinion. Before this case, judges rarely restricted the press, allowing reporters to roam freely through courtrooms and print wild rumors as absolute fact. That changed completely after the highest court ruled that the media circus had robbed a man of his basic right to a fair trial. Today, judges use strict orders, move trials to different cities, and carefully screen jurors, all because a single Ohio courtroom became a reckless carnival in 1954. For the Sheppard family, the legal victory came far too late to put the broken pieces of their lives back together. The doctor's young son, who was asleep just down the hall when his mother was brutally murdered, grew up carrying the heavy burden of a name forever linked to a gruesome crime. He spent his entire adult life fighting to clear his father's reputation, hiring new investigators and pushing for modern testing long after both of his parents were buried. His relentless battle drained his own finances and energy, proving that the damage of a wrongful conviction is inherited directly by the next generation. This generational trauma sparked a much larger reckoning in the late 1990s, when modern forensic science finally caught up to the decades-old mystery. In 1997, a specialized laboratory in New York extracted ancient DNA from the preserved bloodstains found on the closet door of the murder room. The test results were a seismic shock to the old assumptions, completely excluding Sam Sheppard as the source of that blood. This single scientific finding proved that another bleeding person had been in the house, validating the original story of a violent struggle and permanently altering the historical record of the crime. Yet, even with the power of modern science, the ultimate truth of who killed Marilyn Sheppard remains buried in the shadows. The genetic profile from that closet door pointed toward a man who washed windows at the Sheppard home, but the degraded state of the old sample meant it was not enough for a definitive legal match. The window washer had a dark history of violence and was known to be in the neighborhood, but without a perfect scientific match, the final piece of the puzzle could not snap into place. The legal system demands absolute certainty to officially close a case, leaving the identity of the true murderer as a permanent, agonizing question mark. The failure to find that absolute certainty serves as a grim warning about the fragile nature of justice when the rush to judgment outpaces the search for physical evidence. The 1954 investigation became the ultimate textbook example of how a compromised crime scene destroys the chance for true resolution. Police academies across the country now teach the Sheppard case as a dark lesson in what not to do when arriving at a bloody home. The tragic mishandling of the house is the reason modern detectives immediately tape off scenes, restrict access, and meticulously document every single drop of blood before anyone else steps inside. But those modern rules offer no comfort to the quiet streets of Bay Village, Ohio, where the ghost of that summer morning still lingers over the lake. The house where the nightmare began was eventually torn down, replaced by a new home that tries to erase the dark memory, but the community can never fully wash away the stain of the tragedy. All that remains of the shattered American dream is a faded police photograph of a broken watch, stopped forever at the exact moment a life was violently taken, and the truth slipped silently out the back door into the dark.